Mel Gibson was leaving the supermarket with a few grocery bags in hand when he felt a small tug on his jacket. Turning around, he saw a little blonde girl in a pink dress, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric tightly. Her wide blue eyes were filled with silent fear. For a moment, she just stood there, trembling, before finally whispering 3 words that made Mel freeze in place. Without hesitation, he reached for his phone and dialed the police. What happened next changed everything. The sun cast a golden glow over the parking lot as Mel Gibson stepped out of the supermarket, grocery bags weighing down his arms. It was the kind of peaceful, uneventful evening he enjoyed. No cameras, no expectations, just a simple errand like any other person. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and warm asphalt, the familiar hum of cars starting and stopping in the distance blending with the chatter of passersby. He had been lost in thought, contemplating dinner plans, when he felt a light tug on his jacket. At first, he dismissed it as nothing more than a breeze or an accidental brush from a passerby. But then it happened again. More deliberate this time. He turned his head slightly, his instincts immediately sharpening. Standing just below his shoulder height was a small girl, no older than 6, her blonde hair catching the evening light. Her wide blue eyes were filled with something he couldn't quite name at first. Uncertainty, hesitation, a kind of silent desperation. She clutched at his jacket, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric like a lifeline. He noticed how she trembled, barely able to stand still. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. Her lips quivered, forming silent words before her throat finally managed to release the smallest whisper. 3 words. Words that made Mel freeze in place, the weight of their meaning sinking into his gut before he even fully processed them. A chill ran down his spine, and his grip tightened on the plastic bags in his hands. The moment stretching far longer than it should have, as he processed the situation unfolding before him. He scanned the surroundings, his gaze flickering between parked cars, wandering pedestrians, and distant streetlights flickering on as dusk approached. Nothing seemed out of place. No one appeared to be searching for a lost child. The girl remained by his side, her breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. Instinct overrode reason. Without a second thought, Mel shifted his bags to one hand and reached into his pocket for his phone. He had been in enough tense situations to know when something wasn't right. He dialed emergency services, his thumb hovering over the call button, when a voice sliced through the air. "There you are." The shift was immediate. The girl stiffened at the sound, her grip on his jacket releasing, her small frame pulling inward. Mel turned, his gaze locking onto the woman approaching. She moved with hurried strides, her smile wide and practiced. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight bun, a crisp blue blouse tucked into her jeans. Everything about her appearance was curated, composed. But her eyes, they were wrong. They carried a sharpness, a calculation behind the manufactured warmth of her expression. She reached the girl in a few quick steps, her hands settling on the small shoulders with an ease that should have looked reassuring, yet instead made Mel's stomach twist. The child didn't react. No relief. No recognition. She remained frozen, head slightly bowed, her posture tense. "My God, you scared me," the woman continued, her voice light but slightly forced. "You can't just run off like that." Mel didn't say a word. He had learned, over years of experience, that silence was more revealing than immediate confrontation. He simply observed, his gaze moving between the woman and the girl. The way the child didn't lean into her. The way her fingers curled into fists at her sides. The way she kept her eyes downcast, avoiding even the smallest acknowledgement. The woman finally glanced at him, offering a polite nod. "Thank you so much for staying with her. I'm her aunt. She gets nervous in crowds." She laughed, as if expecting him to do the same. He didn't. Mel watched the scene unfold with meticulous focus, every detail pressing into the back of his mind like puzzle pieces waiting to be arranged. He had seen lost children before. They cried, they clung, they called out for help. They didn't stand frozen in fear. They didn't shrink away from the people claiming to be their family. His lips parted slightly, considering his words carefully. The woman was already pulling the girl closer, her grip tightening just enough for Mel to notice. The child still hadn't spoken, still hadn't shown any sign of relief. Mel's gaze sharpened, his gut churning. This was wrong. He adjusted his stance slightly, making himself an obstacle without seeming confrontational. The woman noticed, her polite smile faltering for the briefest moment before she quickly masked it. "She's okay now," the woman added, almost as if trying to wrap the conversation up neatly. "We should be going." But Mel wasn't ready to let this end just yet. His voice came low, steady. "She hasn't said a word." The woman blinked, a flicker of irritation in her eyes, before she quickly covered it with another soft chuckle. "Oh, she's just shy. She's always been that way. You know how kids are." But Mel wasn't looking at her anymore. His attention remained on the girl, studying the smallest details. The way her tiny shoulders trembled, the way her lips parted slightly, as if trying to say something, but failing. Her small fingers twitched at her side, then clenched again. The battle happening within her was almost painful to witness. Then, so subtly that it might have been missed by anyone else, she made a small, almost imperceptible movement. She took half a step back. It was slight, barely noticeable, but it told him everything he needed to know. Mel's jaw tightened, his decision made in an instant. He wasn't letting this girl leave with this woman. The woman sensed the shift, her grip on the girl's wrist tightening. "Come on, sweetheart," she said, her voice laced with an urgency she tried to mask. "Say thank you to the nice man." The girl remained silent. The woman forced another smile, but this time the mask was beginning to crack. Her fingers tensed around the small wrist, her knuckles paling. She started to pull the girl forward, subtly but deliberately. Mel moved before he had time to second-guess himself. His arm extended slightly, blocking their immediate exit. "Hold on," he said, voice even but firm. "I think we should have someone from security come over, just to be safe." The woman froze for a fraction of a second. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but not to Mel. Her eyes flickered, a silent calculation flashing through them. The shift was so brief that it could have been mistaken for hesitation, but Mel had seen it before. The moment someone realized they were losing control of a situation. "Oh, that won't be necessary," she said, her tone sweet but tight. "I appreciate your concern, really, but I know how this must look. It's just a little misunderstanding." She took another step forward, trying to maneuver past him. Mel didn't budge. His gaze remained steady, locked onto hers. Then there shouldn't be a problem waiting a few minutes. The air thickened, the tension becoming almost suffocating. The woman's fingers twitched at her side, her mask slipping inch by inch. She was searching for a way out. And then it happened. The girl's lips parted. No sound came out at first, but then, barely above a whisper, she said something. It was quiet, fragile, but undeniable. "Help!" That single word shattered the facade. The woman reacted instantly. Without warning, she yanked the girl's wrist, pulling her roughly toward her. Her eyes were no longer warm or gentle. They were cold, sharp, filled with something that sent a surge of adrenaline through Mel's veins. She wasn't planning on sticking around. The moment the girl whispered that single word, Mel felt every muscle in his body tense. It was quiet, barely audible, but it carried more weight than anything else that had been said in the last few minutes. The woman reacted immediately, yanking the girl by the wrist with sudden force. Her movements were sharp, desperate, no longer trying to maintain the illusion of calm control. The air between them shifted instantly. This wasn't an awkward misunderstanding anymore. This was something much darker. Mel's instincts, honed from years of handling high-pressure situations both on and off the screen, kicked into full gear. He had seen deception before, felt the tension in moments just before chaos unfolded. And right now, he was at the center of something he couldn't afford to ignore. "Let go of her," he said, his voice low, firm, carrying a weight that left no room for argument. The woman's grip tightened, her knuckles white. She pulled harder, attempting to put distance between herself and the escalating situation, but Mel stepped forward, blocking her path completely. The girl was struggling now, small gasps escaping her lips as she resisted. "I don't know who you think you are, The woman snapped, her voice losing its practiced politeness. But you need to move. This isn't your business. Mel exhaled slowly, keeping himself measured. He didn't want to escalate things to the point of violence, but he wasn't about to back down either. Not with the way the child was reacting. Not with the unmistakable fear in her eyes. You're not taking her anywhere. The woman's expression flickered, something between frustration and calculation. She glanced around the parking lot, realizing people were beginning to take notice. A couple of passersby had slowed their steps, sensing the shift in energy, their eyes darting between Mel and the woman. Realizing she was losing control of the narrative, she switched tactics. Her voice softened, though it was laced with feigned exasperation. Look, I don't know what kind of trouble you think you're preventing, but I'm her guardian. She's just frightened because she got lost. She's overwhelmed. Mel didn't buy it for a second. He could hear the artificial patience in her tone, the way she was trying to pacify the situation without actually addressing it. He had met people like her before, people who manipulated, who knew exactly how to twist circumstances in their favor. He turned his focus to the girl. Are you okay? The girl's breath hitched, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to form words. She looked at him, then at the woman, then back at him. And then, instead of answering, she did something that shattered any remaining doubt. She took a step toward him. It was small, hesitant, but it was deliberate. Mel moved instantly, positioning himself between her and the woman. The woman's expression darkened. You don't know what you're doing, she hissed, her voice dropping into something far more dangerous. I know exactly what I'm doing. The woman's fingers twitched, her eyes darting around again, searching for a way out. Then, without another word, she made a break for it. She let go of the girl and turned on her heel, moving quickly toward the rows of parked cars. Mel didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone as he took a step forward. Hey, he called out, but she was already weaving through the lot, disappearing between vehicles. He turned to the girl, who looked up at him, still shaken. Stay with me, he said, his voice softer now, but firm enough that she knew he meant it. She nodded, pressing herself closer to his side. With his free hand, Mel dialed 911. This is Mel Gibson, he said when the operator picked up. I need officers at Market Plaza parking lot immediately. There was an attempted child abduction. The operator immediately began asking questions, but Mel's focus remained sharp. He answered quickly, giving as many details as he could while keeping an eye on the area. The woman had disappeared, but he knew she couldn't have gone far. Sirens sounded in the distance, not a minute later. The girl tensed at the noise, but Mel rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder, grounding her. You're safe, he told her. I promise. The police cars pulled in fast, their lights cutting through the dimming evening sky. Officers stepped out quickly, moving with the efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times before. Mel didn't wait for them to ask. He gestured to the girl. She was grabbed by a woman who claimed to be her aunt. But something was wrong. She was scared. The woman took off when I wouldn't let her leave with the kid. The officers exchanged glances before nodding. One of them knelt down to talk to the girl, keeping his voice soft, reassuring. She hesitated, but eventually whispered something in response. Mel stepped back slightly, letting them handle it while his mind raced. He knew this wasn't just a random incident. The way the woman had reacted, the way she had tried to control the situation until she realized she couldn't. It was too calculated, too rehearsed. He turned as another set of sirens blared through the air, and then he saw her. The woman had tried to flee through the other end of the parking lot, but she hadn't gotten far before another unit intercepted her. The officers moved in quickly, apprehending her as she shouted something he couldn't hear from where he stood. Mel exhaled, feeling some of the tension ease from his shoulders. One of the officers walked back toward him. We got her. Mel nodded. Good. The officer studied him for a second. That was quick thinking. Mel didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked back at the girl, who was still talking to another officer. She seemed small, fragile, but something in her posture had changed. She wasn't trembling anymore. She asked for help, he said simply. That was enough. The tension in the parking lot hadn't completely dissipated. Even as the woman was apprehended and secured in the back of a police car, Mel could still feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The adrenaline that had carried him through the last several minutes was only now beginning to fade, leaving behind a simmering sense of disbelief and quiet anger. He had almost let that woman walk away with the girl. Mel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. The officers were speaking in hushed tones, exchanging details about what had just happened. A few were questioning the woman, though her responses were clipped and defensive. She wasn't putting up much of a fight, but her eyes still held that same unsettling sharpness, darting between the officers as if searching for an escape route. The girl, however, remained the center of his focus. She stood a few feet away, wrapped in the protective presence of two officers who were crouched beside her, speaking in gentle tones. She was still shaken, her small hands gripping the hem of her dress, her eyes occasionally flickering toward Mel before darting away again. He recognized that look. She wasn't just scared of what had almost happened. She was scared of what came next. He didn't blame her. Mel took a slow step forward, keeping his movements measured. He wasn't sure if she wanted him near or if she even fully trusted him yet, but he wasn't about to walk away without making sure she was okay. One of the officers noticed his approach and straightened, offering him a nod of acknowledgement. "She's still processing," the officer murmured, his tone low enough that only Mel could hear. Not saying much. Mel knelt beside them, giving the girl space, but lowering himself to her level. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet, unassuming. "You did great." The girl hesitated, her grip on her dress tightening. But she didn't back away. "That was something." One of the officers spoke up again. "Do you have any idea where your parents might be, sweetheart?" She blinked slowly, then shook her head. No words. Just that tiny movement. Mel frowned. The woman had called her Sophie, but there was no telling if that was even her real name. He looked toward the officers. "Has anyone checked with the store? Security cameras? Maybe she was in there with someone before all this started." The officer nodded. "Already on it. A few of our guys are inside asking the manager for footage. If she was with anyone before this, we'll know soon." Mel exhaled through his nose, nodding. But something about this still wasn't sitting right. The way the woman had reacted when he started asking questions, the way she had known the girl's name before the girl had spoken a word, it wasn't random. This wasn't just some opportunistic abduction attempt. It had been planned. The girl had been watched. He glanced at the woman still sitting in the back of the squad car. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her attention was fixed on the officers around her, her expression unreadable, lips pressed into a thin line. Mel turned back to the girl. "Do you remember anything before you saw me?" he asked gently. "Were you with someone?" Her fingers twitched a small, barely there motion. She was hesitating. Then, finally, she gave the smallest nod. Mel felt his chest tighten. "Oh." One of the officers prompted softly. "Was it a parent? A friend?" The girl didn't respond right away. She looked toward the squad car. Not at the woman inside, but beyond her. Toward the far end of the parking lot, where shadows stretched long under the glow of streetlights. Mel followed her gaze. His stomach dropped. There, standing just at the edge of the lot, partially hidden behind a row of parked cars, was a figure. Distant, but unmistakably watching. Mel's blood ran cold. He stood abruptly, motioning to the nearest officer. "There's someone watching us." The officer's head snapped up, following Mel's line of sight. The figure didn't move, but they didn't run either. "Stay with her," Mel told the officer before he started moving. The moment Mel took a step in the figure's direction, they turned. Their silhouette disappeared into the darkness between vehicles. "Hey!" Mel shouted, quickening his pace. Another officer moved with him, both of them breaking into a jog as they wove through the parked cars. Mel's heart pounded, adrenaline surging again as they rounded the corner, only to find the space empty. The figure was gone. The officer beside him muttered a curse, hand resting on his radio. "Dispatch, we have a possible additional suspect in the area. Male, average height, dressed in dark clothing. Last seen near the south end of the parking lot. Requesting backup." Mel's hands curled into fists at his sides. He scanned the lot, searching for any trace of movement, any sign of someone still lingering. But there was nothing. Whoever it was had vanished. He turned back, jaw tight. This wasn't random. The officer didn't argue. No, it wasn't. They made their way back toward the squad cars, Mel's mind racing. If that guy had been watching, waiting, then the woman in custody wasn't acting alone. And if she wasn't acting alone, that meant there were more people involved. More moving parts to this situation than they had accounted for. As they reached the group again, the girl's gaze flickered up toward him. Mel hesitated, then crouched beside her again. "Did you know him?" he asked softly. The girl swallowed, pressing her lips together. Then, slowly she nodded. Mel felt his stomach sink. One of the officers nearby cursed under his breath. "We need to find out who she belongs to. Fast." Another officer returned from inside the store, shaking his head. No reports of a missing child matching her description. No security footage of her entering with an adult. It's like she just appeared out of nowhere. Mel exhaled sharply. No, she didn't. He looked back toward the empty space where the man had disappeared. She was put here. Mel felt a deep chill settle in his bones. The girl hadn't just been taken, she had been placed. This wasn't some isolated event. It was part of something larger, something calculated. And now, the man who had been watching them had disappeared into the night. He turned back to the girl, who still stood between two officers, her hands gripping the hem of her dress. She looked smaller now, almost lost in the sea of flashing police lights and uniformed figures. Mel crouched down again, keeping his voice steady. "You're safe now, but I need you to tell me something, okay?" He kept his tone soft, trying not to scare her any more than she already was. "Do you know that man? The one who was watching us?" Her breath hitched, her fingers twitched, and then, slowly she nodded. Mel's stomach clenched. "Who is he?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the squad car, where the woman who had tried to take her was sitting. Then, she shook her head quickly, as if afraid to answer. Mel glanced at the officers, silently communicating that they needed to get this information carefully. One of them knelt down beside him, adjusting his stance to seem less imposing. "Sweetheart, you're not in trouble. We just need to know so we can keep you safe." Still, she remained silent. Mel exhaled slowly, trying to piece together the situation. This wasn't a random abduction. The woman had been too prepared. She had known the girl's name before she'd even spoken. And now, there was another person involved, lurking in the background. One of the officers tapped his radio. "We need a full perimeter search. If this guy is still in the area, we need to find him. Now!" Several officers nodded and moved quickly, scanning the parking lot and the surrounding streets. Mel stood, watching them fan out. He had been in enough intense situations to recognize when something was bigger than it first appeared. And this was something deeper, something worse. One of the officers approached him. "We need to figure out who this girl is. There's no missing child report matching her description. No parent has come forward. It's like she doesn't exist." Mel frowned. "She has to have someone looking for her. Kids don't just appear out of nowhere." The officer nodded grimly. "Unless someone made sure no one was looking." Mel clenched his jaw. The idea made his blood run cold. Suddenly, the girl tugged at his sleeve. He looked down, surprised to see her stepping closer, her eyes wide and desperate. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him as if trying to decide something important. Then, finally in the smallest whisper, she spoke. "He's coming back." Mel froze. His entire body went rigid. "Who is?" Her tiny hand gripped his sleeve tighter. "The man. He always comes back." The officers around them stiffened. One of them immediately spoke into his radio, calling for more units. Mel felt the weight of her words settle over him like a storm cloud. If this wasn't the first time this had happened, then they weren't dealing with just one kidnapper. They were dealing with something organized, something rehearsed. He crouched down again, leveling his gaze with hers. "Has he taken you before?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Just once." Mel swore under his breath. One of the officers exchanged a look with him. If she's been taken before, there's a chance she's not the only one. Mel's mind raced. We need to get her somewhere safe. Now. And we need to find out who else is involved in this. The officer nodded. We're already running checks on the woman we arrested. If there's a connection to something bigger, we'll find it. Mel didn't like the feeling in his gut. He had spent his entire career portraying men who fought against evil. But this was real. This was happening in front of him, and it made his skin crawl. The girl suddenly flinched, her eyes darting past him. Mel turned just in time to see a dark figure stepping out of the shadows at the far end of the lot. It was the man, the same one who had been watching them earlier. Mel's blood ran hot. There, by the cars. The officers reacted instantly. Freeze! Hands where we can see them. The man didn't run. That was the part that made Mel's stomach tighten. Instead, he just stood there watching, calculating. Then, slowly, he took a step back, vanishing into the darkened alley beyond the parking lot. Move! One of the officers shouted, and several of them broke into a sprint, chasing after him. Mel stayed behind, his heart pounding as he looked back at the girl. She was shaking, her small frame trembling from head to toe. It's okay, he reassured her. They'll catch him. She looked up at him, eyes glistening with something he couldn't quite place. They never do. Her words hit him like a gut punch. This had happened before, and they had never caught him. Mel clenched his jaw. Not this time. Not if he had anything to do with it. Minutes later, the officers returned, frustration clear on their faces. He's gone. Disappeared into the alley. We're getting more units on it, but he knew the area too well. Mel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He'll be back, she said so herself. One of the officers nodded. Then we need to be ready. Mel looked down at the girl, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. He wasn't going to let her become another unsolved case. He looked at the officers. Whatever you need me to do, I'm in.